For nearly 11 months, the public has been watching what looks like a straightforward story unfold. Blake Lively files a lawsuit, alleges misconduct, and is positioned as the clear victim of a hostile and inappropriate work environment. That narrative has been repeated so often that most people now accept it as fact. But what if everything we've been seeing is an illusion? What if the case everyone assumes is strong is actually hanging by a thread? Because once you strip away the selective framing, the redactions, and the carefully crafted complaint language, what remains is a case riddled with contradictions, credibility problems, and evidence that Blake Lively herself appears desperate to hide. The most important thing to understand is that Blake Lively's lawsuit is not the same as Justin Baldoni's lawsuit. They are fundamentally different in structure, strategy, and transparency. Justin Baldoni's filings are public. His exhibits are public. His text messages are public. He placed them into the court record, knowing full well they would be scrutinized. Blake Lively, on the other hand, is attempting to seal the very same text messages that already exist in the public domain because Baldoni introduced them first. That alone should make anyone pause. If the text support her claims, there is no logical reason to hide them. If they are neutral, there is no reason to mark them confidential. The only reason to seal communications that are already public is because, when viewed in full context, they undermine the story being told. If someone were to read only Blake Lively's complaint and ignore everything else, they might reasonably conclude she was wronged. That is precisely the point. Her complaint is designed to be read in isolation. It removes context, extracts phrases, summarizes conversations instead of quoting them fully, and presents conclusions without the surrounding dialogue that would allow the reader to evaluate tone, reciprocity, or intent. Lawsuits are not decided on vibes or impressions. They are decided on evidence, timeline, consistency, and credibility. And that is where this case begins to fall apart. Wayfair has now filed 2 dispositive motions that put Blake Lively's lawsuit in serious jeopardy. The first is a motion for judgment on the pleadings, arguing that her employment discrimination claims are legally barred because they rely on California law being applied outside California's territorial boundaries. California's FIA protections do not apply extraterritorially. They do not govern conduct that occurs outside the state. According to Wayfair, none of the alleged discriminatory conduct occurred in California. If the judge agrees, the case ends immediately without ever reaching discovery disputes, witness testimony, or a jury. That alone should not be overlooked. But even if Blake survives that procedural hurdle, the motion for summary judgment is far more devastating. In it, Wayfair argues that even taking the evidence in the light most favorable to Blake Lively, her claims do not meet the legal standard for sexual harassment or a hostile work environment. There is no genuine dispute of material fact. And critically, Wayfair reframes the analysis away from isolated allegations and toward the environment Blake Lively herself fostered. Sexual harassment law requires courts to examine the totality of the circumstances. That includes mutual conduct, reciprocal language, whether behavior was welcomed, whether it was encouraged, whether it was consistent over time, and whether the complaining party engaged in the same conduct they later claimed was offensive. This is where Blake Lively's own words become the most damaging evidence against her. One of Blake's central claims is that she needed extensive protections to feel safe returning to work. She points to a 17-point agreement that she characterizes as necessary guardrails against inappropriate conduct. But Wayfair demonstrates that nearly all of those protections were already in place before she demanded them. No personal conversations, no hugging, no discussions of marital or intimate relationships, no commentary on appearances, no use of the word sexy, no spontaneous or unscripted kissing. These were already established norms on set. Moreover, the formal amendment to her loan-out agreement that would have codified these terms was never signed. Despite that, Blake still received significant concessions, including editing approval and increased creative control. She even brought Sony, originally only the distributor, into a more active role in production. This is not the behavior of someone without power. This is someone exercising leverage. Perhaps the most glaring contradiction involves the intimacy coordinator. Blake Lively claims there was no intimacy coordinator, and that explicit scenes exceeded what she agreed to in the script. But a text message dated April 5th, 2023, tells a very different story. Justin Baldoni explicitly tells her he has hired an intimacy coordinator and wants to set up an introductory meeting. Blake responds by saying she feels good and can meet the coordinator when filming starts. In other words, she declines at that moment. Later, she complains that there was no intimacy coordinator. That contradiction alone creates a serious credibility problem, especially when deposition testimony from the intimacy coordinator confirms involvement. Courts do not look kindly on plaintiffs who say no to protections, and then later claim those protections never existed. Then there are the text messages that Blake Lively now wants sealed. These messages show her venturing into territory that she later characterizes as inappropriate. In one exchange, she tells Justin Baldoni that if he knew her better in person, he would understand how flirty and yummy her ball-busting is. She calls it her love language. She describes herself as spicy, playfully bold, and suggests she can act it out for him. She is not talking about the character Lily. She is talking about herself. She explicitly says, "If you knew me in person." That distinction matters because it collapses the boundary between actor and character. Justin Baldoni's response is striking by contrast. He does not flirt back. He talks about being emotional, about his children, about his family leaving for weeks. He then redirects the conversation back to the character, emphasizing that Lily needs to be witty, playful, and bold, and explaining why he cast Blake for those qualities. He consistently distinguishes Blake from Lily. Blake does not. That distinction alone undermines the claim that Baldoni was driving inappropriate personal interactions. Once filming begins, Blake's own conduct continues to erode her claims. On the very same day she accuses Mr. Heath of entering her trailer inappropriately, the following day she texts Justin about a sexy beanie she plans to wear. One of her core complaints is that Justin used the word sexy inappropriately, yet she uses the same word herself repeatedly, including to describe her wardrobe, her character's look, and even other women she says she would check out on the street. This is not cherry picking. These are her words in her texts. On the same date, she claimed she was deeply uncomfortable. What makes this even more problematic is that many of these text messages were already public in Wayfair's lawsuit. Blake is now marking them confidential in her own case, despite the fact that the public has already seen them. She has even sealed communications between Justin and the intimacy coordinator that were previously available. This is not about privacy. It is about narrative control. It is about preventing the public, the press, and potentially a jury from seeing the full picture. There are also texts sent after the alleged incidents that are impossible to reconcile with claims of ongoing sexual harassment. On the same day Blake claims she was offended by comments and behavior, she exchanges messages thanking Justin, praising his work, telling him she is proud of what they accomplished together. She repeatedly refers to herself as a ball buster. She expresses appreciation, empathy, and mutual respect. People who feel genuinely harassed do not typically send affirming messages praising the person they claim harmed them, especially not immediately afterward. Even after she escalates complaints to Sony, she continues engaging in the same manner she claims was inappropriate. She invites Justin into her trailer. She later claims no one was allowed in her trailer. She brings him coffee. She picks up drinks for him and another cast member. She thanks him for empathy. She reciprocates emotional support. This is not about intent versus impact. This is about conduct that simply does not align with the story being told after the fact. Blake may argue that consent can change, and that something acceptable at one point can later become unacceptable. That is true as a general principle. But courts look at behavior after alleged incidents to assess credibility. And Blake's behavior after these incidents does not suggest someone who felt violated, intimidated, or harassed. It suggests someone engaged in a collaborative, emotionally open working relationship that only later became reframed once external pressures entered the picture. What is particularly striking is the timing. Many of these issues intensify when Blake returns home, when her husband becomes involved, when demands for dailies increase, and when control over the film shifts. The same period that she claims emotional distress coincides with her gaining more power over production. That coincidence cannot be ignored. At the end of the day, Blake Lively's case does not hinge on smear campaigns or external narratives. It hinges on her own text messages. Messages that already exist. Messages that contradict her complaint. Messages that show mutuality, engagement, warmth, and agency. Messages she now wants sealed because once they're lined up chronologically, once context is restored, and once the full conversations are visible, the illusion disappears. This case does not collapse because of what Justin Baldoni said. It collapses because of what Blake Lively herself wrote. Once you move past the surface-level allegations and begin placing Blake Lively's own communications into a chronological timeline, the inconsistencies become impossible to ignore. The law does not operate on isolated moments. It operates on patterns. And the pattern that emerges here is not one of a woman being subjected to unwelcome conduct while attempting to shut it down. Instead, It is a pattern of reciprocal engagement, encouragement, affirmation, and continued emotional closeness that directly contradicts the claim of a hostile or abusive environment. One of the most damaging aspects of Blake's case is that her behavior after the alleged incidents does not align with how a reasonable person would act if they genuinely believed they were being sexually harassed. Courts routinely examine post-incident conduct to assess credibility. It is not dispositive on its own, but it is highly persuasive. When someone claims they were deeply uncomfortable, violated, or distressed by another person's behavior, yet continues to initiate contact, express admiration, and invite further interaction, it creates a serious problem. That problem only grows when the communications are contemporaneous, not months later, and when they are sent in writing, not recalled after the fact. On multiple occasions, Blake thanks Justin Baldoni for his empathy, praises his work, and expresses pride in what they accomplished together. These are not generic professional courtesies. They are warm, affirming messages exchanged on days she now claims were emotionally traumatic. In one exchange, after allegedly offensive conduct, she responds to Justin by telling him that she is proud of everything they did that day and that she appreciates him greatly. This is not the language of someone trying to create distance or establish boundaries. It is a language of someone maintaining closeness and mutual respect. What makes this even more problematic is Blake's repeated use of the same words and themes she later claims were inappropriate when used by others. She objects to the word sexy being used to describe dialogue or scenes, yet she uses that word herself, freely and enthusiastically, to describe wardrobe choices, character looks, and even how a woman might appear walking down the street. She describes a beanie as much sexier, explains how it justifies exposed skin, and openly says she would check out a woman dressed that way. These are not private journal entries. These are texts she voluntarily sent to the very person she now accuses of inappropriate language. Sexual harassment law does not punish words in isolation. It examines whether conduct was unwelcome and whether it created an objectively hostile environment. When the complaining party uses the same language in the same context with the same person, it becomes extremely difficult to argue that hearing that language from the other side was inherently offensive. At minimum, it raises a factual dispute about whether the language was mutually accepted at the time. Another critical issue is Blake's repeated blurring of the line between herself and the character she was portraying. In several communications, she does not distinguish between Blake and Lily. She describes her own personality, her own flirtation style, her own love language, while discussing creative choices for the character. That conflation matters because later, when she claims conversations about the character felt personal or invasive, the text messages show that she herself invited that overlap. She framed the character through the lens of her own personality, not as a separate fictional entity. This blurring also has implications beyond the legal claims. It provides context for why others involved in production may have believed certain conversations were acceptable. If Blake herself repeatedly presents a character as an extension of herself, describes how she personally would deliver lines, and invites discussion rooted in her own traits, then conversations that later feel uncomfortable can be traced back to her own framing. That does not eliminate her right to set boundaries, but it does significantly complicate her claim that boundaries were clearly violated without her participation. The issue of the trailer is another example where her actions and allegations collide. Blake claimed she did not want people entering her trailer, and that an incident involving a colleague entering uninvited was deeply upsetting. Yet later communications show her inviting Justin into her trailer to run lines while she was pumping. She characterizes the trailer as a private space that should not be entered, but then selectively invites the very person she later accuses of violating that boundary. Again, consent can change, but when boundaries are enforced inconsistently, courts look closely at whether the alleged violator could reasonably understand when access was permitted and when it was not. The timeline becomes even more problematic when you examine Blake's conduct immediately following days she now identifies as the most disturbing. On those same days, or the days immediately after, she is sending war messages, engaging in creative collaboration, and continuing the same tone she claims made her uncomfortable. This is not a situation where someone clearly expressed discomfort and the behavior continued regardless. This is a situation where no objection appears in real time, followed by continued engagement, and only later is a conduct recharacterized as offensive. Another major weakness in Blake's case is her handling of the intimacy coordinator issue. The text messages show that Justin proactively hired an intimacy coordinator and attempted to introduce Blake to her. Blake declined at that stage, saying she felt fine and could meet later. Later, she claims there was no intimacy coordinator and that scenes were inappropriate as a result. That is not merely a factual dispute. It is a contradiction. When someone declines a resource and later complains it was unavailable, credibility is severely undermined. It also suggests that the lack of intimacy coordination was not forced upon her, but was, at least in part, a result of her own choice. Wayfair's filings also highlight that many of the protections Blake demanded were already standard practice. This undermines the narrative that she was fighting an uphill battle to impose basic boundaries. The evidence shows she was accommodated, given creative control, and allowed to influence production decisions far beyond what most actors receive. That context matters because it shows she was not powerless or ignored. She was heard. She was negotiated with. She got what she wanted in many respects. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this case is Blake's effort to seal communications that are already public. The law generally disfavors sealing documents without a compelling reason, especially when they do not contain trade secrets, personal identifiers, or sensitive proprietary information. Thank you texts, expressions of pride, and discussions about wardrobe do not meet the standard for confidentiality. The fact that Blake claims she needs more time to review documents to determine what should remain sealed, when those documents have already been seen by the public in another lawsuit, strains credibility. It suggests delay, obfuscation, and an attempt to control the narrative rather than protect legitimate privacy interests. There is also the issue of timing relative to her husband's involvement. Many of the escalations and complaints occur after she returns home, after discussions about dailies intensify, and after concerns about control over the final product arise. This does not mean her feelings were fabricated, but it does raise questions about whether personal dynamics outside the workplace influence how past interactions were reinterpreted. Courts are cautious when allegations emerge after the fact and coincide with external pressures or strategic advantages. The legal standard for sexual harassment requires conduct to be both subjectively and objectively offensive. Even if Blake subjectively felt uncomfortable later, the objective reasonableness of that discomfort is assessed in light of the entire context. That context includes her own language, her own invitations, her own praise, and her own participation. When those elements are laid out chronologically, the argument that the environment was hostile becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. What Wayfair's motion for summary judgment effectively does is take Blake's amended complaint and place it side by side with the text she sent, the action she took, and the concession she received. When you do that, redactions begin to lose their power. The story stops being about what was said in isolation and becomes about how Blake Lively herself engaged with the very conduct she now condemns. This is why her text messages are the most dangerous evidence in the case. Not because they contain shocking admissions, but because they show normalcy where she alleges trauma, warmth where she alleges hostility, and agency where she alleges powerlessness. A jury seeing those messages would struggle to reconcile them with the narrative presented in her complaint. And judges, who are trained to evaluate credibility and consistency, will not ignore those contradictions. As this case moves forward, the question is no longer whether Blake Lively can tell a compelling story. She already has. The question is whether that story can survive contact with the evidence she herself created in real time. And based on what is already public, the answer increasingly appears to be no. What ultimately makes Blake Lively's case so fragile is not any single contradiction, but the cumulative weight of them. Each inconsistency on its own might be explained away. Together, they form a pattern that undermines the reliability of her account. Courts and juries do not evaluate credibility in fragments. They look at whether a story holds together when all the pieces are placed side by side. In this case, once the timeline is reconstructed using Blake's own words, the narrative she presents in her lawsuit begins to collapse under its own weight. One of the most striking aspects of the situation is how differently Blake's communications read in real time versus how they are characterized later in legal filings. In the moment, her texts convey enthusiasm, warmth, collaboration, and emotional openness. She expresses gratitude, admiration, and mutual respect. She engages in playful banter. She uses affectionate language. There is no indication of discomfort, objection, or distress in the contemporaneous record. Yet in hindsight, those same interactions are reframed as coercive, inappropriate, or harmful. That retroactive reinterpretation is not how harassment claims are typically supported, especially when the contemporaneous evidence points in the opposite direction. Judges are particularly skeptical of claims that rely heavily on after-the-fact interpretations without contemporaneous corroboration. The absence of real-time objections, boundary setting, or documented discomfort matters. It does not mean someone cannot later realize they were uncomfortable, but it does affect the weight of the claim. When that absence is combined with affirmative messages praising the alleged harasser, expressing pride, and inviting further interaction, the credibility gap widens significantly. Another issue that cannot be ignored is Blake's repeated control over the narrative through selective disclosure. She has chosen to highlight certain phrases while omitting the surrounding conversation. She references messages without attaching them. She summarizes interactions instead of quoting them verbatim. And when those messages are produced by others in a different lawsuit, she moves to seal them in her own case. That approach invites scrutiny. Courts expect plaintiffs to present evidence transparently, not curate it to fit a predetermined story. The sealing issue is especially problematic because the communications at issue are not inherently private. They are not medical records. They are not personal identifiers. They are work-related texts exchanged between collaborators on a film. The fact that they were already public in another proceeding makes the request to seal them appear strategic rather than protective. This creates the impression that Blake is attempting to prevent decision-makers from seeing evidence that contradicts her claims, which can backfire significantly. There is also the broader question of motive and timing. Blake's complaint intensifies at a moment when disputes over creative control, editing authority, and access to footage become more pronounced. She gains increased influence over production during the same period. She alleges emotional harm. While motive alone does not disprove a claim, courts consider whether allegations emerge in conjunction with leverage disputes. When harassment claims coincide with negotiations over power and control, defendants often argue that the claims are being used strategically. The evidence here gives that argument traction. The involvement of her husband further complicates the picture. While a spouse's reaction does not determine whether harassment occurred, it can influence how events are perceived and framed. If texts and interactions that were previously viewed as professional or playful are later seen through a different lens, particularly after being shared with someone outside the workplace, reinterpretation is possible. The law, however, is not concerned with reinterpretation alone. It is concerned with what was objectively communicated and understood at the time. Another element that weakens Blake's case is the inconsistency in how she describes consent and boundaries. At times, she asserts that no one was allowed in her trailer. At other times, she invites colleagues into that same space. At times, she objects to certain language. At other times, she uses that language herself. At times, she claims she wanted strict professional distance. At other times, she engages in personal, emotionally expressive exchanges. These shifting positions make it difficult to establish a clear line that was crossed without her participation. Sexual harassment claims often turn on whether conduct was unwelcome. That is a key legal concept. Conduct can only be harassment if it is unwelcome. The evidence here suggests that, at least during the relevant period, much of the conduct Blake now complains about was not only welcome but initiated or reciprocated by her. That does not mean she forfeited the right to object later, but it does mean the legal threshold for proving harassment becomes much higher. Another damaging factor is the presence of third-party corroboration that undermines her account. Deposition testimony from the intimacy coordinator contradicts her claim that no coordinator was involved. Production documents show that many of the safeguards she demanded were already in place. Communications from other cast and crew do not reflect the environment she describes. When a plaintiff's account is contradicted not only by the defendant, but by neutral third parties, courts take notice. The motion for summary judgment is particularly dangerous for Blake because it forces the court to assess whether any reasonable jury could find in her favor based on the evidence. Summary judgment is not about deciding who is more believable. It is about whether there is a genuine dispute of material fact. Wayfair's argument is that there is not. They contend that even accepting Blake's version of events, the law does not support her claims because the conduct described does not rise to the level of actionable harassment, and because her own actions negate the assertion that the conduct was unwelcome. If the judge agrees, the case ends without trial. That possibility looms large because the evidence Blake wants sealed is exactly the evidence a judge would consider when deciding summary judgment. Judges read everything. They are not swayed by headlines or social media outrage. They look at documents, timelines, and consistency. And when those elements do not align, they rule accordingly. There's also the practical reality of how this case would play in front of a jury. Jurors are not legal scholars, but they are deeply attuned to authenticity. They evaluate credibility based on common sense and lived experience. When jurors see text messages that read as warm, collaborative, and affectionate, and then hear testimony claiming those same interactions were traumatic, they often struggle to reconcile the two. Defense attorneys will exploit that gap relentlessly. Moreover, jurors are often skeptical of claims that appear to shift over time. If Blake were to testify, she would be confronted with her own words. She would be asked why she thanked someone she claims harmed her. why she invited him into her trailer after alleging boundaries were violated, why she declined an intimacy coordinator and later complained one was absent, why she used the same language she claims was offensive. These are not abstract legal questions. They are direct, human questions that go to credibility. Another issue that cannot be ignored is the volume of communication. This is not a case where there are one or two ambiguous texts. There are numerous messages spanning weeks and months. The consistency of tone across those messages makes it harder to argue that discomfort was present but unexpressed. Patterns matter. And the pattern here is one of ongoing engagement rather than withdrawal. The idea that Blake's case is being propped up by selective omission rather than substantive proof becomes clearer the more evidence is revealed. Her amended complaint reads very differently when placed next to the actual text. Redactions create a story that does not hold up when the redacted material is restored. This is why Wayfair's filings are so damaging. They do not rely on interpretation. They rely on Blake's own words. At some point, courts must decide whether a case is about genuine harm or about reframing ordinary workplace interactions to gain leverage. That determination is uncomfortable, but necessary. Not every uncomfortable interaction is harassment. Not every regret is misconduct. And not every emotional reaction creates legal liability. Blake Lively's case is approaching that moment of reckoning. The more she fights to keep evidence sealed, the more it suggests that transparency would not favor her. The more she insists that context be ignored, the clearer it becomes that context is her greatest enemy. If this case proceeds, it will not be decided by public sympathy or celebrity status. It will be decided by documents, timelines, and credibility. And on those metrics, the foundation of her lawsuit appears increasingly unstable. The heart of this case is a simple but uncomfortable reality. When allegations are stripped of emotional framing and examined alongside contemporaneous evidence, the story they tell changes. What Blake Lively has presented through her filings is a narrative built on isolation, isolated comments, isolated moments, isolated feelings, while what Wayfair has placed before the court is continuity. And continuity is deadly to a claim that depends on selective memory. The legal system is designed to test stories against evidence, not against intention or identity. It does not ask whether someone later felt regret, embarrassment, or emotional discomfort. It asks whether at the time the conduct occurred, it was unwelcome, severe, pervasive, and objectively unreasonable. When a plaintiff's own conduct contradicts those elements, the law does not bend to accommodate feelings after fact. That is the position Blake Lively now finds herself in. One of the most damaging consequences of this case moving forward is that Blake cannot control the order in which the evidence will be seen.